Hey everyone, so my name is Ronnie Woo and my pronouns are he, his, and him. Welcome to WWF's The Green Room, a space where we talk about all things related to the climate crisis. We learn about the incredible work being done and what each of us can do to help prevent the worst impacts of a warming world. You may recognize me from either television, social media, or as an author of my upcoming cookbook, Did You Eat Yet? Today, I'm joined by WWF's Heather Wright and PhD candidate Alexa White. So Heather, do you mind taking a moment to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ronnie. It's great to be here with you today, and we really appreciate you taking the time to support conservation. It's so important. My name is Heather. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and here at WWF, my work focuses on taking habitat loss, like forests, grasslands, and mangroves, out of our major food commodity supply chains. Our goal really is to harness the power of markets and major industries to create more sustainable systems. So think about things like working with farmers and companies to figure out ways to produce things like soybeans or palm oil without having to cut down forests or plow up grasslands. This work includes partnerships with farmers, governments, companies, banks, and others in the food system to really transform how money is invested in these systems and really ultimately reduce the impacts of how we produce our food on people, nature, and the climate.
Thank you, Heather. I mean, it's so great to meet you today. Thank you so much for sharing. And then Alexa, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your area of expertise.
Of course. Again, my name is Alexa White. Hello. My pronouns are
Hello.
she, her, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And so I'm classically trained as an agroecologist working on small-scale farms and how they fit into international climate governance. And so I'm specifically focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as the focal point of my dissertation, as well as kind of the initiatives and things that I'm a part of in my personal life.
Amazing. Well, I'm super excited to be here with both of you today. And I'm super excited to have a conversation about something that we're all very clearly passionate about, which is food. When we as consumers think about food, we most likely think about our day-to-day meals, but there's so much more that goes into what we see on our plates. Heather, can you tell us a little bit more about how what we eat relates to the health of the planet? So like what we need to know about outside of our own kitchens or even the grocery store.
Of course, Ronnie, this may take you a bit by surprise, but food actually has a real impact on the planet. In fact, many of the food systems, which include everything from how we grow food to how it's turned into other products, and even how it's packaged and moved around, and even more, all make up about 25 to 35% of the human-caused emissions. And that's a huge contribution to the climate crisis, all coming from food and the stuff we eat and buy. It's a global issue, as you mentioned, and it requires all of us from all levels of society to make a difference.
Amazing. Thank you for that. So how is WWF working to solve this problem?
So as I touched on, WWF works with many groups across the board, from farmers to businesses to governments, on really some critical actions. So some examples of those are protecting habitats by working with companies to stop deforestation and conversion of native ecosystems. And like I mentioned before, like grasslands and forests. And deforestation alone causes about 15 to 20% of our global emissions. And we're losing grasslands like the Northern Great Plains at an alarming rate. And much of this loss actually is due to making room for growing more food and raising livestock. Another example is working along the food value chain with farmers down to retailers to shift to more efficient and regenerative practices and reduce both emissions and the environmental footprint of agriculture. Also, we focus on reducing food loss from and waste, which is a huge issue, from farm to fork, and advocating for better and more equitable supply chain practices, stronger food policies, and policies that better protect people and nature. Obviously, there's many more examples, but those are just to name a few.
Wow, that's a lot of things to do and a lot of things to cover, but it's nice to know that we have people focusing on a lot of those things. So Alexa, it sounds like food production is a starting point of the impact on climate change, which is a key part of your expertise. Can you shed a little bit more insight for us about some of the components of food production that are important for this conversation in particular?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the focuses of my research has been on food sovereignty, and what this topic looks at is how people control food. So how it's produced, how it's distributed, and how it's consumed. And so food sovereignty is a way to describe a food system. The term was coined at the International Farmers Organization, La Via Campesina, and then presented in 1996 at the World Food Summit. And they define the term as peoples, countries, and state unions' right to define their own agricultural and food policy. And so currently we're witnessing the rise of supermarkets, mega farms, excessive use of pesticides. And so food sovereignty is meant for us to take back control of our food and claim ownership of how we conduct agriculture. And so it's also important to keep in mind the role of corporate agriculture in this cog in the machine. So there's something called food regimes. So food regimes are how agriculture has changed through time and specific eras. And so today we are living in the corporate food regime, and it's characterized by agricultural intensification. So we see the overuse of fertilizers, we see monocultural arrangements, which means just lines of single crops, and most importantly, the overuse of pesticides.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Alexa. I mean, that's a lot, and thank you for defining food sovereignty and some of the other terms, because those are very good to know and just like really important facts. Heather, do you have any points that you want to add to what Alexa said?
Yeah, thanks, Alexa. I think I'd just add that, as you mentioned, food and agriculture, they're a huge opportunity to be solutions for climate, nature, and for people. Specifically agriculture, as you mentioned, intensified agriculture has the potential to get below zero in terms of emissions because rehabilitating soils and replanting forests can actually pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And it's just important to note that stopping deforestation and conversion, which is why we're so focused on that, doing that alone would avoid nearly a fifth of the global emissions. And I think, we're all talking about this here, but we can't overcome the climate crisis without also addressing the nature crisis and achieving a 1.5 degree future. To do that, all deforestation must end by 2030. So this is why this has been such a call to action coming up to the COP, and calling on these companies that need to deliver on their own climate commitments and include deforestation as part of that. Often we talk about nature-based solutions as well, and I think it's important to note that these ones have often been practiced by indigenous communities for centuries, and they can deliver massive, massive emissions benefits for nature and help prepare to face against more extreme weather events and other challenges like global food security.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like we're, running out of time to get all this, get things taken care of. And speaking of food security, there's been a lot of conversations about how we are going to feed a growing population. So what are your thoughts there?
It is true that our population is growing at an alarming rate alongside our appetites and global demand for different types of food like protein. That's growing exponentially. So there was a recent stat out that consumption of food and agriculture products grew nearly 50% in the last 2 decades, and that's more than twice the rate of the population increase. So we do have an issue on our hands. And how will we feed that growing appetite, to your question? Some say we need to grow more food, and we need to grow it in the most efficient, responsible, ethical, and sustainable ways possible. But we also need to reduce how much food is lost or wasted and how it's distributed, because oftentimes that's issue is distribution and the waste. And Ronnie, did you know that about 40% of food that's grown is actually never eaten?
I mean, that's insane to me. And, being the fact that I'm Asian, like wasting food or wasting anything is like, it's beyond me. I never waste anything. That's insane to me. Like, that's crazy. I mean, tell me more about that, Heather. Like, how is that 40% of the food that's grown never gets eaten? I don't understand.
Again, I think it's a real issue with distribution and places where food is grown. It's not actually to the people that need it. So there's infrastructure issues for sure, storage. When we the number of people around the world facing malnutrition, hunger, or food insecurity, currently estimated about 1 in 10 people, as well as the urgency of the climate crisis, we really must do everything we can to transform our food systems. Our ability to feed ourselves depends on healthy ecosystems and biodiversity that supports those ecosystems, healthy soils, and ultimately healthy people. So we can't really afford any longer to have so much waste in the system. It's really important that we have a global solution to our food waste problem.
Thank you so much for explaining that, Heather. And so what do you think these solutions look like?
So I could take this one, Ronnie. A key part of my work over the past few years has been working in the realm of international climate policy. And so my focus has really been on sustainable development goals concerning the UN and what that global governance really looks like and how we can improve. And so when I think about waste, I immediately go to the food supply chain. And at the beginning of the food supply chain is usually when the first beginnings of wasteful actions happen. And so with a focus on food production, we can compare the difference between corporate agriculture and small scale agriculture. So corporate agriculture is really concerned with production and maximizing profits, as opposed to small scale agriculture, which is one, makes up most of the world's farms, two, they produce most of the world's food, and then three, we have to figure out how to distribute that food. So when we have a question of world hunger, it's a question of distribution, not a question of production. And so we can't really have a goal to maximize profits because it comes at a cost of food waste. And we produce enough food to feed everyone, so we have to figure out the best way to distribute it.
Thank you so much, Alexa. It just sounds like there's a lot to be done, but I think it's so important that we remain hopeful, and more importantly, we remain knowledgeable about these types of things. One other thing that I would love to learn a little bit more about is how our relationship with food and the climate crisis also has an impact on the conservation of wildlife.
Yeah, Ronnie, I'm really glad you mentioned that. And that's really exactly why we're working on these issues in critical landscapes like the Northern Great Plains, the Amazon, the Cerrado, which is a savanna in Latin America, and the Chaco, also in South America, that harbor significant biodiversity. And they're really at high risk from food production and increasing production. For example, the Amazon is one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. It's home to over 3 million species of plants and wildlife. And that, I think, encompasses about 10% of the world's biodiversity in just that one place. So the Cerrado as well is home to more than 1,600 species of mammals, birds, and reptiles. And both of these ecosystems are being lost and cut down or plowed up for grazing to grow crops like soy, corn, wheat, or even oil palm. In addition, we can't forget what's in our own backyard with the Northern Great Plains here in the U.S., once home to bison, black-footed ferrets, pronghorn antelope, and grassland birds. The populations of some of the songbirds there have declined almost 94% in the last few decades, such an alarming rate because of the conversion for crop production. So these are just some of the landscapes and ecosystems that are threatened by the production of food. And on top of that, when habitats are lost, more greenhouse gas emissions occur, contributing even greater to climate change and the impacts that go along with that.
Yeah, so whenever I hear the conversations about biodiversity, I always go back to thinking about how farms are managed ecosystems. And so in agroecology, we're actually interested in two kinds of biodiversity. Agrobiodiversity, which is any individual species that's placed into a managed ecosystem. And then associated biodiversity, which is individuals or species that come as a consequence of agrobiodiversity. So a lot of the time people are really paying attention to what's on the farm, but not what is happening or being proliferated as a result of what's on that farm. And so just in connection, I was really thinking about how farms provide a space for biodiversity to flourish.
Wow. So it sounds like to me sustainability is really important, sort of knowing where your food is coming from and really being knowledgeable about sort of of the effects of where our food is coming from. Because I think ultimately, from my perspective, as a normal civilian, and not like experts like you guys, but it just really sounds like, it's important for us to know, what is actually, what part of the earth and what part of wildlife and the conservation of wildlife is, how it's being affected. Because ultimately, if we don't have an earth filled with biodiversity, if I'm using that term correctly, then we won't have an earth at all and we won't exist in the future. So it's actually a very scary thing to think about when we think about sort of how much destruction comes from people's sort of desperate need to create more food when there's already so much waste, and when, we have other means to create food in a more sustainable way. So thank you for sharing those facts. It's very eye-opening. So what can people do in their everyday lives to be a part of the solution to reduce these food-related emissions and help the planet and wildlife?
I like the solution-oriented question. I know we've been presenting some dire facts and evidence. So let's get to what actions we can take. I think first and foremost, it's really important to know your food sources. And by getting to know what's in your food, to the farmers and ranchers and brands that are promoting different ingredients and types of production, and even that emphasize transparency in their supply chains, and companies that really promote that with sustainable producers and sustainable practices. I think there's also the key thing, really avoid overconsumption and overbuying, which is a tendency for people to do, as we saw with the pandemic and the rush on certain things. I think there's also, compost when you can, recycle when you can, and always reuse if you can. Just these are things you can do in your home, right? They may seem trivial, but super important. We've seen the plastic patch in the ocean, and we don't want to keep contributing to that. There's also voting with your dollars and with your voices for more sustainable, transparently produced food and equitable food and justice. And finally, really just, you were talking about your own kitchens, eliminating waste from your kitchen and habits that tend to contribute to that waste, and really working with your friends and making it known, like, what are the little actions you can take. Also, supporting restaurants and food establishments that also promote these practices is really important. And finally, just choosing to eat, if you can, that's also kind of a privilege, choosing to eat healthy, diverse diets and avoiding the really processed and packaged foods. So do you have any tips? We're kind of giving tips of what we can do just on the daily. Do you have any tips that we can think about cutting out waste in our kitchen as a chef, and coming from that perspective?
Yeah, totally. And thank you for sharing those tips. I mean, just to say, like, it sounds like it's a lot, but I think ultimately it's like every little piece matters. We can't possibly do, and we can try to possibly do everything we possibly can, but again, we are human. And so it's really our best to really try to do your best in sort of being part of the solution versus part of the problem. For me personally, I think, we kind of mentioned earlier when I was so just taken aback by how much food waste there was. For me, I really think it's about like a few things, really. I like to push the limits of my ingredients, meaning like, if something's wilting in the fridge, I'm not going to throw it away. If some vegetable looks bad, I might just throw it into like a soup. Because wilting vegetables are perfectly edible. They just might not be perfect for a salad, but they're perfect for soup or perfect for roasting. There's a lot of ways to use vegetables, barring that it has mold or it is completely rotten. I think you can use it, and that leads me to the next point, is really just trying to use ingredients before they go bad, and really I really love the freezer. I think the freezer is a great way to preserve ingredients. So for instance, even like berries or fruit, they can be frozen and you can throw them into a smoothie. If you have vegetables or you have meat that's about to, go bad, make sure you cook it and then freeze it, or just freeze it before it goes bad. Anything, just be conscious of what you have. For me, I always take inventory of my fridge. I take inventory of everything that I have. I know exactly what I have in my fridge. I actually have like a mental Rolodex of expiration dates, which also leads me to the next point, is that expiration dates are general guidelines, I think, set by companies. Lots of times, my belief, I'm not skeptical of big companies, but I like to say that the expiration dates are a guideline to when you should really start thinking about using it up. So if you're a little past the expiration date, just use your common sense. If something smells bad, it's probably not great. But there's no way someone's going to be able to tell you this is the exact date that you're not supposed to eat this, So again, just use your common sense. And lastly, if you're making like your food and you have an excess of food, don't throw it away. Just share it with your family and friends. I think that's a really, really good way of, again, making use of all your ingredients and all the resources that we have access to. And I think ultimately, generally, just kind of know where your food is coming from. Like, we want to try to buy sustainable foods. And it sounds kind of like, it sounds like it's a difficult thing to know where your food comes from, but it's really not. It's about supporting, local farmers and things like that. Because, again, we want to sustain the earth because, for our children, for our children's children, just for the future, because without an earth, we don't exist. So I think that's ultimately what we think about. And it's just doing every little thing that we can. So, it's not about tackling everything all at once. It's just about tackling each little step one at a time and just doing your part. I think we just have a little bit of time left. So would either one of you guys care to share any final thoughts on that?
Thanks, Ronnie. I think I would just add that based on all the comments and great updates and facts and what everyone's doing, it's important to remember that you can't really separate people from like equity issues, from conservation, from climate, and these things are all interlinked. So hearing about what Alexa's doing with the sustainable development goals at an international level, to like Ronnie, what you were talking about, to what you can do in your kitchen, all of these things are so important to achieve, like you said, a healthier, happier planet and healthier, happier people.
Yeah, and I guess I'll finish up by saying the people who help get our food to the table are oftentimes oppressed and their voices are ignored worldwide. And so they are a reservoir of valuable knowledge and it's being squandered as we speak. So there has to be a major shift in how our food systems operate in order for us to see any kind of change. And this begins with us. This begins with our viewers. It begins with everyone. And so food is a climate and environmental issue that we encounter every single day. And shifting away from industrial food production, corporate agriculture, is critical if we're ever to make any major achievements in conservation and climate resilience. So thank you, Heather and Ronnie.
Thank you both again for sharing your tips and extensive knowledge with us today. And thank you all of you guys for tuning in. I hope you guys all have a great day.